Professor Nam Yong Lee's long-form commentary, Korea's national liabilities of 2,600 trillion won, corporate debt of 2,900 trillion won, and household debt of 2,000 trillion won. Who will repay them, when and how? First, I will organize Korea's total debt burden in numbers. The moment we separate national liabilities by whose debt it is, reality becomes clear. Debts carried by individuals and households, debts carried by corporations, debts carried by the central and local governments, and debts carried by public corporations and state-owned enterprises are interconnected, but their repayment sources and accountable parties are different. When this distinction is blurred, the cost is always pushed onto the people, while accountability disappears. Household credit, the most widely used indicator of household debt, stood at 1,968.3 trillion won at the end of the third quarter of 2025, consisting of 1,845.0 trillion won in household loans and 123.3 trillion won in sales credit. This number looks enormous, not merely because debt is large, but because housing and asset prices are tightly entangled with financial regulation, causing shocks to spread in a chain from delinquency to financial institutions, then to real estate prices, then to consumption, employment, and finally tax revenue. On the public side, the metrics come in layers. For fiscal year 2024, general government debt, D2, is presented as 1,270.8 trillion won, public sector debt, D3, as 1,738.6 trillion won, and national liabilities in the government's consolidated financial statements as 2,585.8 trillion won. Even when we speak of the same national debt, the figure changes depending on what is included, and this multimetric structure itself can easily become a mechanism that blurs public perception and weakens policy accountability. If we look inside the 1,968.3 trillion won of household credit, it is the combined outcome of personal credit loans, loans to borrowers with self-employed characteristics, Jones-related lending and mortgages, and sales credit generated through card usage. That is why it is difficult to publicly separate individual debt from household debt with precision, and in real life a single household's repayment capacity is determined by a mixed cash flow of housing costs, education costs, business financing, and consumption. If policymakers ignore this and merely tweak product by product or institution by institution rules, debt will simply shift form and migrate channels while the overall total remains. The 1,845.0 trillion won in household loans is divided into 1,159.6 trillion won in mortgage loans and 685.4 trillion won in other loans. In other words, debt backed by housing collateral already amounts to 1,159.6 trillion won and is directly linked to interest rates, real estate, and the national business cycle, while the 685.4 trillion won in other loans runs through daily living, business activity, education and consumption, and is more likely to turn into delinquency during downturns. By lender type, of the 1,845.0 trillion won in household loans, 1,320.0 trillion won is held by deposit-taking institutions such as commercial banks and non-bank deposit-taking institutions, while 525.0 trillion won is held by other financial institutions. Within the deposit-taking category, loans split further into 1,003.8 trillion won at commercial banks and 316.2 trillion won at non-bank deposit-taking institutions, and during periods of rising interest rates and tighter regulation, lending can migrate across institutions, pushing vulnerable borrowers toward higher rates and weaker protections. Now consider the macro illusion created by 2,871.9 trillion won of corporate debt. Corporate debt can be an engine of investment and innovation, but it can also become a way to delay restructuring while surviving on leverage. Korea's total credit to non-financial corporations is captured at around 2,871.9 trillion won in nominal terms, as of the second quarter of 2025. This scale is a key variable that can amplify stress across the financial system when combined with interest rates, exchange rates, export cycles, real estate project finance, and supply chain shocks. The core risk of corporate debt explodes when the repayment burden deteriorates relative to cash flow. When sales weaken, firms cut investment and hiring first. That shock flows into household income and consumption, and the stress ultimately returns through household delinquencies and financial sector fragility. In other words, corporate debt is not merely a corporate problem, but a relational problem that links household debt and national fiscal capacity as well. Reducing corporate debt requires more than suppressing total lending. It demands restructuring centered on productivity and profitability. If the economy fails to identify weak segments of corporate balance sheets, stronger firms will move abroad while only high-risk debt remains at home, creating adverse selection. At that point, 2,871.9 trillion stops being growth debt and turns into survival debt. Next is the four-layer accounting of central government, local government, and the broader public sector. Central government debt takes many forms, including government bonds, borrowing, guarantees, and provisions, and the costs the public actually feels emerge as interest expenses, tax increases, or spending cuts. For example, central government debt is reported differently depending on the timing and compilation method, but as of end May 2025, it is discussed at around 1,217.8 trillion won. The true issue is not only the size of the debt, but how fast annual interest costs rise in the budget as rates and maturity structures change. Local government debt is even more complex. Publicly available indicators of total local government debt come with time lags, and for instance, local government debt at the end of 2022 has been presented as 38.3 trillion won. Local government liabilities are intertwined with regional infrastructure, urban development, investments in affiliated entities, and local public corporations, so they may look like project debt on the surface, but in a crisis the burden ultimately falls on residents through local taxes, local fees, and reduced public services. The public sector can also accumulate debt outside the border between national and local accounts. The gap of 467.8 trillion between general government debt, D2, of 1,270.8 trillion and public sector debt, D3, of 1,738.6 trillion for fiscal year 2024 should be read as a signal of how much additional national risk is created by debt held by state-owned enterprises and public institutions outside general government. Furthermore, the 2,585.8 trillion in national liabilities under the consolidated financial statements warns that the potential total burden on the public can appear far larger as accounting standards and inclusion ranges shift. Now examine Korea's vulnerabilities through international comparison. For household debt, structural risk is explained better by the ratio to GDP than by absolute amounts. Under the BIS standard, Korea's household debt ratio, credit to households and NPIS relative to GDP, stands at 89.7% as of the second quarter of 2025. This implies that even an average recession shock can sharply compress household consumption capacity. The contrast becomes clearer in comparison. Under the same metric, the United States is 68.0%, Japan 64.0%, Germany 49.2%, and the average for advanced economies is 69.2%. Korea is markedly higher than the United States, Japan, Germany, and the advanced economy average, which means households function as a much weaker shock absorber in macroeconomic turbulence. Canada, by contrast, is even higher at 98.4%. The lesson is not that a high ratio automatically collapses an economy, but that highly indebted countries can remain resilient only if they maintain high-quality lending structures such as fixed rate and appropriate maturities, strong income safety nets, elastic housing supply, and dense protection mechanisms for vulnerable borrowers. Korea has a high ratio while housing, labour, and financial regulations often remain rigid at the same time, which increases the risk that adjustments become abrupt when shocks hit. Accountability must be clarified through a relational lens. If we simplify the stakeholder groups in the household debt problem, they can be mapped as the borrowers, households holding 1,968.3 billion won, the creditors, banks and non-banks, holding 1,845.0 billion won in loans and 123.3 billion won in sales credit, the housing market anchored by 1,159.6 trillion won in mortgage collateral, the supervisory authorities setting regulatory constraints, the central bank steering interest rates, the government shaping taxes, housing and welfare, and corporations influencing employment and wages. These objects can blame one another, but they form a single chain that cannot be fixed by effort on only one side. Households increase leverage under the belief that rising home prices will make everything fine. Financial institutions narrow accountability through collateral valuations and compliance checklists. The government wavers regulatory signals under short-term economic and real estate sentiment pressures, and the central bank hesitates between price stability and financial stability. As a result, vulnerable borrowers are hit simultaneously by collateral value declines and income shocks the moment price adjustments begin, while policy responses arrive late as patchwork. To allocate responsibility clearly, first, the government has the duty to design housing, tax and financial regulations so they do not contradict one another. Second, financial institutions have the duty to expand protections for vulnerable borrowers and strengthen loss absorption capacity in proportion to the credit they extend. Third, households cannot evade the consequences of leverage that exceeds income capacity. Fourth, political leadership must bear responsibility for destabilizing market expectations by shaking lending rules around the electoral cycle. Household debt diagnosis. Why did asset prices replace repayment capacity as the standard? The conditions under which 1,968.3 trillion won of household credit becomes dangerous are simple. If income does not rise while interest rates rise, or if housing prices fall, or if employment weakens, repayment capacity deteriorates rapidly. In particular, 1,159.6 trillion won in mortgage loans can freeze household sentiment and consumption, even with small swings in collateral values, and that cooling then feeds back into the economy and employment in a reinforcing cycle. Another key mechanism is the migration effect created by regulation. When lending shifts between 1,320.0 trillion won at deposit-taking institutions and 525.0 trillion won at other financial institutions, interest rates rise, protections weaken, and vulnerable borrowers can be pushed into riskier segments. That is why household debt management cannot rely on total quantity control alone and must precisely target the distribution of vulnerable and multiple debt borrowers. Finally, the 123.3 trillion won in sales credit may look small, but it is short-term debt that can deteriorate quickly during downturns. Credit card-based consumption shows distress first through delinquency when income is squeezed, which then triggers credit score declines and higher borrowing costs, making household recovery harder. Household debt is ultimately not a rate problem, but a cash flow problem. Now, I propose 7 prescriptions to end a debt-driven growth model. The first principle is a clear declaration. The 1,159.6 trillion won in mortgage loans is not a byproduct of housing policy, but a core risk asset for financial stability. Instead of repeating slogans about increasing housing supply, the system must redesign approvals, transportation links, floor area ratios, redevelopment, and the rental market as one package to reduce extreme price swings. When volatility falls, leverage incentives fall, and the risk embedded in 1,159.6 trillion won falls with it. Second, lending rules based on repayment capacity must be applied consistently. If rules change with the economy and elections, markets bet not on rules, but on the next easing cycle, and 1,968.3 trillion won becomes structurally more unstable. Rules must be firm, exceptions must be transparent, and protections for vulnerable borrowers must be dense. Third, vulnerable borrowers must be treated not as objects of rescue, but as subjects of rebuilding. For multiple debt and self-employed vulnerable groups, the key is restoring cash flow by connecting debt restructuring with re-employment, re-entry support, and the social safety net. Fourth, financial institutions must reinforce the principle of same risk, same regulation to prevent risk transfer between 1,320 billion, one at deposit-taking institutions, and 525 billion won at other financial institutions, while building loss absorption buffers and provisions proactively during expansions. Fifth, the government must secure accounting transparency and visibility that explains in one page the multiple standards such as D2 at 1,270,800,000,000 won, D3 at 1,738,600,000,000 won, and national liabilities at 2,585,800,000,000 won. Sixth, instead of merely summing central government debt around 1,217.8 trillion won with local government debt of 38.3 trillion won under indicator definitions, authorities must publish annual risk maps that include interest rate sensitivity, maturity profiles, guarantees, and contingent liabilities. Seventh, the conclusion is simple. Buying time with debt will eventually trigger an explosion of costs, and those costs are always shifted onto vulnerable households and future generations. What is needed now is not the technique of tightening loans, but the design of a growth structure that does not require debt to survive. Thank you for watching Professor Nam Yong Lee's long-form commentary.